Hey everybody, Mr. Fantini here. Welcome back to our reading of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Today we're going to be jumping into Chapter 5, but as always, let's just briefly recap what we covered last week in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 started off with Gatsby just showing up at Nick's house and kind of picking him up like, hey, we're going to lunch, let's go. And they proceed to have a very awkward drive into the city where Gatsby tries to relay his true backstory and then tell some wild tales of things that can't possibly be true. Although he does then produce a little bit of evidence to corroborate some details of his kind of crazy story. Uh, at lunch, they meet one of Gatsby's only friends, who is a mob boss, criminal mastermind guy, Meyer Wolfsheim, who fixed the 1919 World Series, which is a real thing that happened, by the way. And then Gatsby disappears without a trace as soon as Tom shows up in the restaurant. We get an idea of why, because in the drive out to lunch, Gatsby informs Nick that he needs a favor from him, but Gatsby's not going to ask the favor. He has Jordan Baker ask him the favor. He's kind of weaving this elaborate scheme of, intrigue and who knows what and who's asking who for what. And then at the end of the chapter, we see Nick and Jordan on a date themselves, and Jordan lets Nick know that Gatsby and Daisy have a history together, and that this huge favor that Gatsby needs is that he wants to invite Daisy over to tea at Nick's house. Crazy favor, right? And that's what we're going to see here in Chapter 5. And I have good news for anyone who really loved the insanely awkward dinner party in Chapter 1, because we're about to have an insanely awkward lunch party in Chapter 5. So let's go ahead and open up to Chapter 5 and jump right in. Here we go. When I came home to West Egg that night, I was afraid for a moment that my house was on fire. 2:00, and the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light, which fell unreal on the shrubbery and made thin, elongating glints upon the roadside wires. Turning a corner, I saw that it was Gatsby's house, lit from tower to cellar. At first it was another party, a wild rout that had resolved itself into hide-and-go-seek or sardines in the box, with all the house thrown open to the game. But there wasn't a sound, only wind in the trees, which blew in the wires and made the lights go off and on again, as if the house had winked into the darkness. As my taxi groaned away, I saw Gatsby walking toward me across his lawn. "Your place looks like the World's Fair," I said. "Does it?" He turned his eyes toward it absently. I've been glancing into some of the rooms. "Let's go to Coney Island, old sport, in my car." "It's too late." "Well, suppose we take a plunge in the swimming pool. I haven't made use of it all summer." I've got to go to bed." "All right." He waited, looking at me with suppressed eagerness. "I talked with Miss Baker," I said after a moment. "I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over for tea." "Oh, that's all right," he said carelessly. I don't want to put you to any trouble." "What day would suit you?" "What day would suit you?" he corrected me quickly. "I don't want to put you to any trouble, you see." "How about the day after tomorrow?" He considered for a moment. Then with reluctance, "I want to get the grass cut," he said. We both looked at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended with the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suspected that he meant my grass. "There's another little thing," he said uncertainly, and hesitated. "Would you rather put it off a few days?" I asked. "Oh, it isn't that. At least," he fumbled with a series of beginnings. "Why, I thought... Why, look here, old sport, you don't make much money, do you?" "Not very much." This seemed to reassure him, and he continued more confidently. "I thought you didn't. If you'll pardon me, you see, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of a sideline, you understand, and I thought that if you don't make very much, you're selling bonds, aren't you, old sport?" "Trying to." "Well, this would interest you. It wouldn't take up much of your time, and you might pick up a nice bit of money. It happens to be a rather confidential sort of thing." I realize now that under different circumstances, that conversation might have been one of these crises in my life. But because the offer was obviously and tactlessly for a service to be rendered, I had no choice but to cut him off there. "I've got my hands full," I said. I'm much obliged, but I couldn't take on any more work." "Oh, you wouldn't have to do any business with Wolfsheim." Evidently, he thought I was shying away from the connection mentioned at lunch, but I assured him that he was wrong. He waited a moment longer, hoping I'd begin a conversation, but I was too absorbed to be responsive, so he went unwillingly home. "So, It's important to remember where we are at the start of this chapter, that Nick is pulling up to his house at 2 o'clock in the morning and sees Gatsby's house completely lit up. From cellar to attic, every light is on, and Gatsby's standing out in his lawn waiting. And then when Nick shows up, Gatsby runs up to him and says, "Hey, how's it going? Do you want to go to Coney Island? You want to take a ride? You want to go for a swim in my pool at 2 o'clock in the morning?" It's obvious to Nick that Gatsby is looking for some kind of pretense, some kind of excuse to spend some more time with him so that he can ask about this favor. The favor, of course, was to invite Daisy over to Nick's house for tea. Ultimately, Nick doesn't really have time for this awkward conversation to come, so he just says, "Look, I'll invite her. It's fine." Gatsby makes some allusion to wanting to make some preparations before Daisy comes over, and then, as a sort of a weird thank you, offers him a way to make a little money on the side. And we know that based upon Gatsby's friend, Meyer Wolfsheim, and this sort of like menacing, unknown past of Gatsby, that he's basically offering Nick a way to make money illegally, some sort of like criminal enterprise that he can help him make a little bit of money, which Nick turns down right away, not just because he's an honest guy, which he kind of sees himself as being, but also because he would see it as sort of like accepting this criminal money in exchange for setting up a date with Daisy, which strikes him as weird. So he just says, "No, it's fine. I'll just invite her over anyway." So they have this weird, awkward conversation at 2 a.m, and Nick says, "Okay, fine. I'll invite Daisy over the day after tomorrow." The evening had made me lightheaded and happy. I think I walked into a deep sleep as soon as I entered my front door. So I don't know whether or not Gatsby went to Coney Island or for how many hours he glanced into rooms while his house blazed gaudily on. I called Daisy from the office the next morning and invited her to come to tea. "Don't bring Tom," I warned her. "What?" "Don't bring Tom." "Who's Tom?" she asked innocently. The day agreed upon was pouring rain. At 11 o'clock, a man in a raincoat dragging a lawnmower tapped at my front door and said that Mr. Gatsby had sent him over to cut my grass. This reminded me that I had forgotten to tell my Finn to come back, so I drove into West Egg Village to search for her among the soggy, whitewashed alleys and to buy some cups and lemons and flowers. The flowers were unnecessary, for at 2 o'clock a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's with innumerable receptacles to contain it. An hour later, the front door opened nervously, and Gatsby, in a white flannel suit, silver shirt, and gold-colored tie, hurried in. He was pale, and there were dark signs of sleeplessness under his eyes. So Nick is taking steps to kind of prepare. He's getting the tea and the pastries ready. But before he can even get the house together, Gatsby has already sent over a landscaper to cut Nick's lawn and sent over a greenhouse worth of flowers. He's basically stuffed Nick's tiny little house with flowers. Clearly Gatsby has a vision of how he wants this meeting to go, right? But then by the time he shows up, and notice how he was dressed as well. White suit, silver shirt, gold tie. Silver and gold. He wants to give off the appearance of silver and gold, of wealth, of richness, right? But despite all these preparations, he doesn't seem like he's having a very good time. "Is everything all right?" he asked immediately. "The grass looks fine, if that's what you mean." "What grass?" he inquired blankly. "Oh, the grass in the yard?" He looked out the window at it, but judging from his expression, I don't believe he saw a thing. "Looks very good," he remarked vaguely. "One of the papers said they thought the rain would stop about 4. I think it was the Journal. Have you got everything you need in the shape of tea?" I took him into the pantry, where he looked a little reproachfully at the Finn. Together we scrutinized the 12 lemon cakes from the delicatessen shop. "Will they do?" I asked. Of course, they're fine," he added hollowly. "Old sport." The rain cooled about 3:30 to a damp mist, though through which occasional thin drops swam like dew. Gatsby looked with vacant eyes through a copy of Clay's Economics, starting at the finished tread that shook the kitchen floor and peering through the bleared windows from time to time as if a series of invisible but alarming happenings were taking place outside. Finally, he got up and informed me in an uncertain voice that he was going home. So they're waiting for Daisy to show up. And Gatsby is just sitting there, staring idly, flipping through books, not reading anything, peeking through the windows, jumping at every sound. He's clearly incredibly nervous about whatever he has planned, right? And then he gets up and says that, "Oh, I gotta go." "Why is that?" Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late." He looked at his watch as if there was some pressing demand on his time elsewhere. I can't wait all day." Don't be silly. It's just 2 minutes to 4. So Gatsby's like, well, she's not coming. It's not even 4 o'clock yet. That tells us how kind of nervous he is and how much he's kind of built up this meeting in his mind. He sat down miserably, as if I had pushed him. And simultaneously there was a sound of a motor turning up my lane. We both jumped up, and a little harrowed myself, I went out into the yard. Under the dripping bare lilac trees, a large open car was coming up the drive. It stopped. Daisy's face, tipped sideways beneath a 3-cornered lavender hat, looked at me with a bright, ecstatic smile. Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down, with my ear alone before any words came through. A damp streak of hair lay like a dash of blue paint across her cheek, and her hand was wet with glistening drops as I took it to help her from the car. Are you in love with me? She said low in my ear. Or why did I have to come alone? Now, this is a line that always kind of makes my students jump a little bit. Are you in love with me? Like, obviously she knows that her cousin Nick isn't in love with her, but Daisy has this way of speaking. It's very kind of charming. She makes a lot of jokes in kind of a dry sense of humor kind of way. But it's not just that. It's also there's a quality that her voice has. I mean, listen to this description of Nick listening to her speak. The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down with my ear alone before any words came through. Fitzgerald is creating this character of Daisy as being almost like impossibly, almost magically charming. She's got a way about the way that she talks to people, the quality of her voice that kind of like brings people in, draws people in. And I want you to pay attention to that voice as we move forward, because one thing that you'll see whenever Daisy is in a scene is that they mention something about the quality of her voice. Okay, so keep an eye on that. That's the secret of Castle Rack Rent. Tell your chauffeur to go far away and spend an hour. Come back in an hour, Ferdy. Then in a grave murmur, his name is Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose? I don't think so, she said innocently. Why? We went in. To my overwhelming surprise, the living room was deserted. So Gatsby, gone, by the time they get back inside. Well, that's funny, I exclaimed. What's funny? She turned her head as there was a light, dignified knocking at the front door. I went out and opened it, and Gatsby, pale as death, with hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. So Gatsby got so nervous, he ran outside into the rain and is now knocking on the door to come back in, soaking wet. That nice fancy suit that he picked out special, right? With his hands still in his coat pockets, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It wasn't a bit funny. Aware of the loud beating of my own heart, I pulled the door to against the increasing rain. For half a minute, there wasn't a sound. Then, from the living room, I heard a sort of choking murmur and part of a laugh followed by Daisy's voice on a clear, artificial note. I certainly am awfully glad to see you again. A pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting frightened but graceful on the edge of a stiff chair. So Gatsby storms into the room, soaking wet, doesn't say a word, and then strikes this pose on the mantelpiece like he couldn't care less about what's going on. He's like acting like he just wandered in, like he's bored. He's just looking around as if Daisy being there is no big deal. Daisy says, I'm certainly thrilled to see you again. So that, again, corroborates that they know each other. They have a history together, right? Let's see if Gatsby gets any smoother as this awkward silence persists. We've met before, muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and then his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously from the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. I'm sorry about the clock, he said. My own face had now assumed a deep tropical burn. He's blushing. I couldn't muster up a single commonplace out of 1,000 in my head. It's an old clock, I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed in pieces on the floor. So, and this is another one of these like symbolic moments, right? Gatsby trying so hard to look like everything's fine, everything's natural, and he's leaning so exaggeratedly relaxed on the mantle that he knocks a clock down. But luckily, he catches it as it falls. Now, clocks are one of these like symbols that when they show up in literature, we know that the author put them for a reason. What might a clock represent? Time, right? And a falling clock, like time passing by, and Gatsby reaching out and catching that clock, almost, defying expectations that he was able to catch it before it fell on the floor and crashed. So keep these ideas in mind about time passing, and the attempt to capture this passing time, because it's a highly symbolic action, as we'll see about Gatsby's personality here. We haven't met for many years, said Daisy, her voice as matter-of-fact as it could ever be. 5 years next November. So Gatsby knows exactly how long it's been since they've been together. The automatic quality of Gatsby's answer set us all back at least another minute. I had them both on their feet with the desperate suggestion that they help me make tea in the kitchen when the demonic Finn brought it in on a tray. Amid the welcome confusion of cups and cakes and a certain physical decency established itself, Gatsby got himself into a shadow while Daisy and I looked contemptuously from one to the other of us with tense, unhappy eyes. However, as calmness wasn't an end in itself, I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. So Daisy and Nick are attempting to have a pleasant, normal conversation over their tea, and Gatsby is just sitting there like a sullen child, not sure what to say, so nervous, so wrapped up in himself that he can't even jump into the conversation. And so this, to Nick, obviously is unbelievably painful, that he's like in this room between these two people who clearly have a history that neither of them are acknowledging. And so he does what any sane person would do. He says, I gotta go pick up something in town. I gotta go. And he leaves. Gatsby will try to stop him, but Nick's like, go ahead. You guys have your conversation, talk about what you got to talk about, right? Now that we've worked our way through that insanely awkward part, I will leave the rest to you, which is a little bit more probably closer to what Gatsby expected, as you'll see how the day turns out. But go ahead and keep on reading chapter 5, and we'll check back in about chapter 6 later, okay? Take care, enjoy the book, and I'll see you next time.